Welcome to another edition of the Swamp247 Podcast. A little bit of a change up here today as I'm your host, Zach Goodall from Swamp247. I'm joined by my co-host today, Tyler Harden. He's our recruiting reporter over at Swamp247. And I know we spoke to you guys on Sunday, right after Billy Napier was let go as Florida's head coach. I'll tell you what, I could speak from my perspective. I know Tyler would say the same thing. It's been a long, arduous 72-ish hours of keeping up with all this, nearly a sleepless night Sunday as we prepared. And on that note, I've told Graham Hall, who typically hosts the show, go and just catch up a little bit on some rest, because I know that he, as well as I, and obviously Tyler, are going to need it as we move forward into this coaching search and the rest of the season, being that Florida made this move at midseason and has a new interim head coach and 5 games left. But Tyler, thank you so much for joining me, man. I'm excited to get into a little bit more reactionary stuff now that we're a couple of days removed and the dust is at least starting to settle.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Thank you for having me on. It's good to be on one of these now. No, man, it's crazy because, like, as the season progressed onward, the idea, of course, of Billy Napier getting fired was always something that, was brought up. Something that, sooner or later we kind of expected. It was just a matter of when. It's a whole different feeling when it actually happens. It was honestly like pretty surreal because, like, there was so much buildup and then, like, it's here, right? So then it's like, all right, now what, right? We have to follow, obviously the coaching search, but then there's a whole different side on the recruiting front, which, is obviously my bread and butter. So it's been a wild 72 hours, and I don't feel like it's really going to let up anytime soon. I feel like it's going to be a long, couple of months with this coaching search, and, kind of like how we're going to talk about, there's going to be a lot of names thrown around. There's going to be a lot of theories, a lot of, controversy, maybe things like that. But hey, man, I'm all for it. This is fun. This is something I feel like the fan base has really wanted for a long time, is, the potential for a really big hire here. I just think, like I said, the fan base has really been wanting this. So it's going to be fun to see how it turns out.
Yeah, and that's exactly why I wanted to get you on today with me, to get that recruiting side. Because when Graham and I came and did the immediate reaction, that's not as much our bread and butter, even though we keep up with it. But also it was so fresh at that point. We recorded, I want to say, 2 hours, 3 hours maybe after it had happened. So we, at least ourselves, did not have a feel for what the recruits are saying. I know you did. I mean, I know that even before the firing happened, you had started to figure it out a little bit, get some feelers from some recruits, because I think that even they, as high school players who are looking forward to the future, had a feel for where this was going. I know you were doing your research, catching up with them, so I really would like to get your reaction as to what some of them have said, some of the moves that are already starting to be made relative to visits and so forth. But we'll start with the dust settling internally, with the people that are actively a part of this program. We talked about it on Sunday that Billy Gonzalez was being installed as the interim head coach. We got to speak with him, Scott Stricklin, the athletic director, and 3 players on Monday in a press conference, being DJ Lagway, Jake Slaughter, and Miles Graham. And I'll go ahead and start us off with some of their reactions. I mean, first off, I think Billy Gonzalez, to give it the part that fans want to hear, I think the most in this very moment, aside from a coaching search, is they wanted to hear what the interim head coach had to say about moving forward to try and finish the season on a strong note. And from my perspective, there's really no better pick than Billy Gonzalez, just given the time and dedication that he's had with this program, being in his 3rd stint, being a 2-time national championship winning position coach here at Florida. And he was talking about, he's excited for this opportunity, not looking forward to auditioning for a head coaching role. I think Florida fans assume that he wouldn't be in consideration here. But for example, Colorado State, where he went, opened up the same day as Florida did. So naturally, people were wondering, say he goes 5-0, is he looking forward to this being a resume builder for that job? And he talked about coaching and players playing for the patch that's on his shirt, the Florida Gator logo, how proud he is to have this opportunity to step in and lead this team for the next 5 games. He talked a little bit about the offense, as Scott Stricklin did as well, and that's something that I'll get into in a little bit. but he's made some tweaks. There's not going to be any staff changes, at least as of right now. No one else has been relieved of their duties. They're maintaining the coaching staff that's been in place, obviously, sans Billy Napier. But it was an interesting move. I talked the other day that I thought Russ Callaway would be the natural step in as the play caller, as the offensive coordinator. That's not going to be the case. Quite frankly, Russ Callaway's job doesn't seem like it's changing. He's going to maintain leadership responsibilities during the week. He's going to be doing game planning, but it's going to be Ryan O'Hara that's calling plays for Florida's offense. And Billy Gonzalez specifically mentioned he thought the chemistry, the rhythm between O'Hara being the quarterback's coach and DJ Lagway being the quarterback, the relationship they've built, makes that a dynamic that's going to be worth exploring here, and one that should be relatively seamless. He wants Lagway to get used to O'Hara, even though they already communicate frequently, being the guy in the headset, being the one that with the green dot, which he called an advantage now, that helmet radio communication between coach and quarterback. He wants that to solidify, and he believes that will be beneficial moving forward. But really, I think the biggest part of Coach Gonzalez's talk the other day was just how proud he is, again, to represent this program in an elevated role compared to what he's done in the past, given how much he has provided to this team. Keeping it on DJ Lagway and the players, Jake Slaughter, obviously in his last year, he's not so much looking forward to the future of a new head coach, as excited as he will be for that person, just because, he's out the door once that new head coach comes in. But DJ Lagway and Miles Graham both affirmed their commitment to Florida long-term. Obviously, things change. We know how this business goes. Transfer portal and opportunities elsewhere, NIL money. There's going to be Florida players that leave this team. I would guarantee it come a time that once a coach is solidified, even if Florida knocks it out of the park. But in the same vein, DJ Lagway, and this adds up with things I've heard along the way, even before Napier was fired, it would take a lot, in my opinion, to get him out of Gainesville. He really is happy being here. I think he's made Florida, and his family for that matter, has made Gainesville a second home. He knows he has a ton of resources at his disposal. He's very proud of the foundation and partnership he has with UF Health here. It's just going to take a lot. And then Miles Graham, obviously legacy Gator. I view him as probably the most safe, almost, maybe if you don't include Vernell Brown, also a legacy Gator, one of 7 members of his family to be here. There's going to be players you can look at who you feel pretty safe about. Miles Graham's in that conversation. He came out and said as much when he was meeting with us yesterday. In fact, he even spoke to his father, Ernest Graham, about what you do when you go through a coaching change, because his dad was a part of the roster that moved from Steve Spurrier to Ron Zook back in the early 2000s. So a lot of positive things coming from them. Then obviously Scott Stricklin. He said quite a bit during his press conference. They're going to have an expansive, diligent, and thorough search, is the way he put it. And I think you liken that to when he hired Billy Napier. It was like a week-long process. It's been reported there were no other interviews conducted. He knew he wanted Billy Napier. He went and got him. That's not going to be the case this time around. They've got several weeks and they're working. I'm not trying to suggest they're going to take their time and lollygag, but they are going to take their time to vet the candidates that they want, to interview as many as possible, and go from there. They don't need to rush to make a decision right now. There will come a time where they definitely need to have one locked in. And Tyler, I know you'll want to expand on that with the recruiting aspect, but they don't need to have someone figured out within a week. Stricklin's not afraid of utilizing as many resources as he needs to. Now, Florida's pool, he noted, is not unlimited relative to the amount of money they can spend. I mean, you look at the $21 million buyout they're spending to Billy Napier. But he specifically said that the resources are not going to be the reason why we don't make the right decision going forward here. And that to me sounds like Florida is going to be willing to spend the money it needs to land the top or a top coach on its list this time around. They brought in a search firm, Turnkey ZRG. I do want to specify, as I did on Twitter yesterday, that is not affiliated with Zachary Robert Goodall. He'll be listening to the advice and opinions he gets of boosters, of people in the UAA, people around the program. But perhaps much to Florida fans' dismay, Stricklin is saying he will be solely responsible for this hire. It will be his pick. That no one's coming in when the boosters were brought up. No one's reaching over to take the steering wheel from him. he wants to be the one and will be the one that ultimately decides who Florida's next head coach is. And I found that interesting. You pair that with what he said the other day. They're going to keep this confidential as much as possible, going to try to eliminate leaks. He wants to run a tight ship in picking this next head coach, and we'll see if that's ultimately how it plays out. But I, quite frankly, have plenty of reasons to believe it. I mean, there's a reason he got his contract extension from UF. They believe in him. Florida fans can have their opinions on it, and outsiders can have their opinions on it, but he's made it clear he's going to be the decision maker here. Long-winded, I know. We're through the internal reactions, I would say, without getting too much further into all the fluff around it. Tyler, I want to hear what you've been hearing when it comes to recruits that you've reached out to, just what the general vibe is, if this was something that some of them expected, if they're considering visits elsewhere. I know you've reported on a couple, even like without knowing specifically what some of their plans are. If there's like maybe a spectrum of players that you consider safer than others relative to Florida's recruiting class, barring some significant change and everyone hating the hire or everyone loving the hire, whatever the case may be, just like your general overview as to how recruits are seeing this move and what their excitement level or maybe cause for concerns are at this point.
Yeah, no, I mean, I feel like at this point, you can kind of compare it to, the recent firing of James Franklin at Penn State and how that class kind of unfolded. Florida hasn't really been the same in Penn State's case. Penn State, I think, 4 or 5 guys decommitted that day when James Franklin was fired. Obviously, we didn't see that with Florida. In fact, nobody's left the class yet. I feel like Florida, these guys that, the guys I've talked to, at least, it's more of a wait and see type of thing, right? There's going to be guys that take visits, right? You kind of have to in this case because, there is in that head coach role, there's a giant question mark. Obviously, we don't know who it's going to be. These guys have to explore their options. They're going to do so. There's going to be a handful of guys probably every weekend that go take visits elsewhere. That's going to be the norm, right? So, yeah, it's a lot of wait and see right now. I mean, there's, the guys that are locked in, Will Griffin, Janari Carr, the guys who have been locked in right when they committed and haven't looked, past the Florida Gator logo, they're staying that way, right? But there's a lot of guys in between right now. CJ Hester, Caden Hall, Chancellor Campbell and Tyler Chikuiam, guys like that are, they're looking elsewhere, right? They have, those are just some names that off the top of my head. There's some, other schools are starting to reach out, they're keeping their options open, but there's a lot of guys that are, doing so, right? KJ Ford is another one, he's kept his options open really the entire fall. That's not going to change. So expect that from, the majority of the guys. They're going to keep their options open. They're going to keep, their door cracked, but nobody's, gone as far as to completely open their recruitment up. And no, I'm not sure how long that will be until somebody decides to go that far, just because of the uncertainty that's kind of inevitable at this point.
What would you say when you look at this and you compare it to Penn State again, with the commitments they lost immediately? Obviously, there's intrigue because people believe Florida can bring in a really high quality coach. But aside from that, is there a general sense, whether it's among the recruits or even just in your opinion, like what's so attractive about Florida at this point, having fired a coach and not been successful the last few years as a football program, that's keeping players intact?
Yeah, like you just said, man. I mean, there is a really good chance that Florida's going to make a really good hire here, right? Nobody's stranger to the names being thrown around. Lane Kiffin, Eli Drinkwitz, Marcus Freeman, guys like that. That's the type of hire I believe personally Florida is capable of making and, will likely make. So I think a lot of guys are kind of thinking the same thing and deciding to see like, hey, what moves will Florida make, in these next few weeks, at least to see, maybe I can stay put, right? And I won't have to, kind of get to know another staff kind of once again on that level at least. So I think a lot of guys are going to choose to take that approach. Not all, of course, but I think, some guys will. And then the other thing, man, just getting to know these guys and everything, just getting to cover them. this class of 2026 is a very tight knit group, right? I mean, a lot of these guys come to every home game. You know, Desmond Green drives down 5 hours every home game to come down to Gainesville. These guys are very close, right? You know, just kind of talking to them in person, talking to them over the phone. They're the tight knit chemistry this class has comes up like every other phone call, every other conversation I have. These guys are like genuinely like friends with each other already. And it's crazy because they haven't played a snap of football together yet. So, I mean, that's just good to know. I feel like in general, no matter what the hire is, just knowing that freshman class is already on that level, I feel like is just food for thought. But I feel like that also just plays into, the fact that this class may want to stick with Florida because they want to stick together. Right. Jarraylen McCoy, I had a conversation with him the other day. He's a very outspoken leader in this class. Right when the news hit, he hit the group chat and he said, "Hey, we got to stick together through this." Right. So guys are saying things like that rather than like, "Oh no, what are we going to do?" type of thing. There's a much more confident mindset within this group, at least the majority. And, those are the two big things I think right now are surrounding this Florida class.
I'll want to get back into, well, actually, this is a segue, I guess. I do want to talk about the candidates, or maybe not so much candidates yet people are speaking about that have already started to emerge, at least externally, and paired with what we're hearing at 247, that have emerged for this job. And I want to get your opinion on them as recruiters, or at least who you think of this pool would, be best fit to recruit at Florida. But, obviously it all starts with Lane Kiffin, right? And there's plenty of buzz going from Ole Miss. You're hearing about the potential of a contract extension. You're hearing plenty of people being worried about losing someone that's been so great for their program, that has truly re-energized Oxford in a way that just it hasn't been in a long time. It's my sense that he is going to be at the top of the board. He is probably at the top of the board. And, again, Scott Stricklin's intending on keeping this close to the vest as much as possible, but he made it very clear, at least in my opinion, that they're not going to necessarily risk it on an up-and-comer unless, they're forced to step back into their plans B and C, but they want to go get someone that's established. For that matter, I don't necessarily think this will be a rushed process again, because most of the coaches that are established are going to be making a push for the college football playoff, and therefore it'll even push into the signing day window. But you look at someone like Lane Kiffin, Marcus Freeman's another one that's been rumored quite a bit, not just at Florida, which is interesting to me. I know Florida fans, like the idea of Marcus Freeman, but he's a name that's come up at Penn State, and you see other big openings that probably will emerge. I would imagine his name is going to keep coming up. Again, I find that interesting. He was literally just in a national championship game last year at Notre Dame. What that means, there are rumors about how he's feeling about Notre Dame. Time will tell ultimately if it's all for naught. Maybe he's trying to leverage another contract extension, but he just got one fewer than 11 months ago. So it's interesting to me that he's in these conversations. Eli Drinkwitz at Missouri is another one that's come up a lot, being he for kind of a similar deal to Lane Kiffin, in the sense that he went to a program that, as of late, before he got there, really was not the caliber that for Ole Miss, I guess, what it used to be. But Missouri's never really been much of a powerhouse. And that's not to say that they are an absolute powerhouse now, but he's arguably done the best job of any Missouri coach in history. And that's someone that I would imagine is going to be high on Florida's list. And there's a couple of others as well that are standing out, names that get floated. There's also some that get floated externally that I think are not worth paying a ton of mind to. And I just want to start off right now by saying, John Gruden, are we being serious? I've seen articles written about John Gruden linking him to Florida, and I think that it's a bunch of baloney, quite frankly. I mean, this guy hasn't coached since 2021, hasn't coached any position in college since 1991, and has never been a college head coach. There's obviously the email scandal that ended his time with the Raiders back in 21, regardless of what you think about that. And personally, I would tend to think that Scott Stricklin, we've heard the rumors as to what he may have previously thought about Lane Kiffin being eccentric, outspoken, not so much a fit. I don't know how you hire someone that was fired for an email scandal for saying inappropriate things about other teams and members of the league. I don't know why you would covet someone like that if that was your thinking about candidates previously. But again, regardless, it's just like he hasn't made the NFL playoffs since 2007. We're talking about nearly 20 years. So it just doesn't make much sense. Jeff Brom is someone that was previously not mentioned to me when I put together the hot board for coaching candidates over at 247. I've since been asked about him quite a bit by our members. And I understand the appeal. My thinking is that as well as he's done at Louisville, I'm not necessarily sure people would have been pushing for him too much if it weren't for the results of this past weekend with Louisville beating Miami, right? That changes things quite a bit. And obviously that will lead to interest, not just from Florida, but I'm sure other jobs. But at least at this time, I don't think that he's someone that they are really prioritizing. Maybe that could change. Again, we got a lot of time here and a rather extensive time frame compared to last time Florida had an opening. So anything could happen. But you're going to see, I mean, every day that we go that Florida hasn't hired Lane Kiffin, quite frankly, you're going to hear a new name pop up, someone that was hot that weekend and had a great game. Oh, well, what about Florida? Are they in the mix here? And I would just caution against putting too many eggs in any certain basket for that case. I stick with what I was saying, that I think Lane is going to be near, if not at the top of the board. And some of these other candidates, again, they're going to try and go for someone established. So just kind of keep your eyes on that mark, in my opinion. And kind of to that note, again, I want to get your feel for when you look at this pool of candidates that we've got out there, even beyond some of the names I mentioned, just who would stand out to you as someone that fits as a recruiter at Florida? And then after that, I'm also curious to know what you think their priorities should be, what the first step should be for when a new coach, whoever it may be, arrives at Florida pertaining to recruiting.
Yeah, I mean, if the hire was going to be strictly a recruiting hire, it might look a lot different than like the common names being brought up right now. But in a way, maybe not, because, the main factor, I feel like when it comes to recruiting that, the potential hire would need to have in my mind is a sense of relatability, right? And that's something both Lane Kiffin and Eli Drinkwitz, in my opinion, both have. Obviously they're both big personalities. They relate to these guys that they recruit, these guys that they have on their roster. They relate to them a lot. They're both successful in the transfer portal. These are guys that, players want to play for. And I feel like that's something Florida's going to need. If they're going to make a big splash hire, that's something that, that's a box that needs to be checked off regardless, hands down, in my opinion. Right. And, like you said, they're both coaches that they win at the end of the day, right? That's the most important box you need to check off. Drinkwitz is an up and coming coach. Kiffin's resume is one of the best in college football. That's why he's the most sought after coach right now for, available positions around the country. So those are my top two candidates right now that, Florida needs to prioritize. Should they put all their eggs in those two baskets? Absolutely not, right? I feel like they need to have an open mind throughout this process. Like you said, they have time, use it, right? So, but I think those two names, stick out to me the most on a recruiting front, just relatability, resume development, things like that. Those are the two names I think right now, Florida needs to put at the top of their list.
And I know this isn't a question that I had prepared you for, so if you need a second to think it over, have at it. But Billy Napier was the 10th FBS coach fired this year, if you include a couple that happened in the offseason, Stanford, and certainly not to the extent of some of the other FBS openings we're talking about, but Kent State was in that one as well. Are there any other openings that, from a recruiting perspective, or even just from a, looking at trying to make the best hire possible, that concern you for Florida's sake right now? And along those lines, are there any potential ones that would scare you too? Obviously, there's so much discussion right now about the future for Mike Norvell at Florida State, and Florida State has since come out and said they're offering Mike Norvell their full support through the end of this season. And then there will be a comprehensive assessment as to what the future of Florida State football looks like. But when you hear that, when you hear statement season, when you get votes of confidence, although Scott Stricklin gave Billy Napier one last year and it ended up being a vote of confidence, so many times you see that, and by the end of the year, the coach is gone. So all that said and done, are there other programs you're kind of keeping your eye on as to how it could impact Florida from a coaching search as well as specifically a recruiting standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, Florida State's going to be the big one, right? You know, when it comes to a recruiting standpoint, two in-state programs, right? Usually when there's an in-state kid and Florida likes him, Florida State likes him too, right? If Florida State likes a kid, usually Florida likes him too, right? It goes both ways. Obviously, you could throw Miami in the mix there. But yeah, I mean, just from, you know, what the coaching search might look like similarity wise, you know, Florida State, you know, is another program that could make that big splash higher. But another one I kind of want to throw in, and, you know, there hasn't been as much of a scare at this program as, you know, a Florida State where, you know, a statement had to be put out, you know, no statement has been put out at this other school, is LSU. Right. You know, there is a lot of speculation about Brian Kelly. I feel like his, you know, his seat is getting hotter by the game, and, you know, losing to Vanderbilt at Vanderbilt and, you know, allowing them to get a top 10 rank, that doesn't help things. Right. I feel like, you know, since Brian Kelly got to Baton Rouge, you know, there hasn't been, you know, an up or downward trend. It's kind of just plateaued its way through. And, you know, as an LSU alum, of course, you know, that's not the standard there. Right. So I feel like, you know, LSU is going to be another program, you know, that could compete in the same way as Florida for this coaching search. And, you know, that might throw, you know, kind of a wrench in things when it comes to Florida's search, because, you know, there could be one, potentially two other competitors competing for those same guys. Yeah, I mean, those are the two right now on a recruiting front, you know, being geographical competitors for the same guys. You know, LSU being another SEC competitor. You know, those are the two right now that pop out to me the most.
And I think I'd be remiss before we wrap things up. There was one reaction from Scott Stricklin that I did leave out earlier as I was going through his very lengthy transcript. Florida fans, obviously, we've talked a good bit throughout this on this podcast throughout the entire season, on the message board going back before the season, even when I was covering Florida for a different site for the first two seasons of the Napier tenure, about play calling, about the offense, about its struggles to this point. I found it very interesting. Scott Stricklin really wasn't willing to go into the details as to why he made the move when he did, what stood out to him about why it didn't work for Billy Napier at Florida, other than, of course, the wins, the lack thereof, I should say, not being competitive enough, especially with what he believes is a very talented roster. He made that very clear. He was thankful for what Billy Napier did behind the scenes, and the first thing he mentioned was building the roster to the strength it's at right now, among other projects that were done behind the scenes to really enhance and bolster the student athlete experience at Florida, not even just pertaining to football. But he was asked about the offense, and he mentioned that while he's not the type to go in and make a demand of his head coach, he doesn't want to interfere. He's not there to make assistant coaching hires. He recommended to Billy Napier at one point, and I would tend to believe it was earlier this year when there were rumors of a potential offensive coordinator coming in, that he tried to encourage Billy Napier to at least think about that. He thought that he was better with the big picture approach, the CEO style approach, as people like to call it, and that he would benefit from taking those responsibilities off of his plate. Billy Napier obviously didn't listen, and Scott specifically said that's probably a part of why we were there on Monday discussing Billy Napier being fired. So as you leave this podcast, I guess I would take that into consideration a bit here. Obviously, we've seen a lot of coaches giving up play calling, offensive or defensive for that matter. I don't necessarily believe it rules out a coach if they want to be the play caller, but I would imagine that Scott Stricklin, having been through this, having experienced this firsthand with Billy Napier, will see it as a perk if a coach, even if they're an offensive mastermind, a defensive mastermind, but they understand where the state of college football is right now, that's not necessarily beneficial to do a balancing act of calling plays and leading a team across all units, not just one. At a minimum, I would think he's going to want some assurance from whoever they bring in, if they do want to be the play caller, that they would be willing to give it up if it's not working out. And again, as we saw, that's not what Billy Napier was willing to do. And I think that ultimately was one of the biggest reasons for his demise at Florida. Anyway, Tyler, thank you so much for joining me today, man. I think this is great. Would love to get you back on the show with me and Graham. I think we could have some fun in the next couple of weeks with the three of us, just going over the things that we're hearing, the things we're observing. And I'm happy that we got to bring everyone these reactions today. So thank you again, man.
Absolutely, man. I can guarantee you the next time I'm on, things are going to look completely different. That's just the age of college football that we're in. And, you got to love it, right?
No doubt. No doubt. Well, with that, I'm Zach Goodall from Swamp247. That's Tyler Harden from Swamp247. We appreciate you guys checking out today's episode of the Swamp247 podcast, and we will see you next time.